My name is Mara Kessler, and on the morning I was supposed to marry Julian Voss, I found out he was already dead. That's what the police told me at 7 a.m., standing on my porch in the gray light, hats in their hands. Car accident on the coastal highway, they said, no survivors, the car burned before anyone reached it. I remember the wedding dress hanging on my closet door, white and patient, waiting for a man who would never come. My mother screamed. I didn't. I went very quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like drowning without water. 3 hours later, Julian's assistant, a thin nervous man named Peter Cho, arrived at my apartment carrying an envelope. Julian had written it the night before, he said, in case anything ever happened to him. I opened it with hands that didn't feel like mine. Mara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I need you to do one thing for me. Sell your father's shares in Voss Textiles to my brother Adrian before the estate lawyers get involved. It's the only way to protect you from the debt. Trust me one last time. I read it 4 times before the words stopped swimming. My father had built that company from nothing, and on his deathbed 2 years earlier he made me promise never to let it slip out of our family's hands, not even into Julian's, which was why I still held 40% of the voting shares in my own name even after we got engaged. Julian knew that. He knew it better than anyone, because he'd spent a year convincing me marriage would make it simpler to combine our shares under one name. Now, apparently, his final wish from the grave was for me to hand it over to his brother. I sat on the floor of my living room, wedding dress still swinging gently on its hanger, and I cried until I had nothing left. That night I dreamed of my father's voice, low and steady, the way he used to sound before board meetings. He never told me what to do in the dream. He just kept repeating one sentence. Don't sign anything you haven't read twice, Mara. I woke up at 3 in the morning with that sentence sitting in my chest like a stone, and for the first time since the police knocked on my door, a small cold thought slid in beside the grief. Why would Julian, dying suddenly and violently in a car crash, have had time to write a calm, organized letter about corporate share transfers the night before? People who plan to die in car accidents don't write forwarding instructions for their stock portfolio. I went to the funeral home 2 days later to identify what remained of him for the closed casket, a formality the lawyers insisted on. The attendant handed me a small sealed bag of personal effects recovered from the wreck, a watch, a ring, a phone case melted at one corner. I turned the watch over in my palm. It was the wrong watch. Julian wore a Patek Philippe his father had given him, engraved on the back with his initials, JV, and the date of his college graduation. This watch had no engraving at all. I didn't say anything to the attendant. I put it back in the bag and thanked her and walked out into the parking lot and stood there for 10 minutes, staring at nothing, running the numbers in my head like my father taught me to do whenever something in a contract felt slightly off. Adrian Voss had been unusually calm through all of this, calm in a way that funerals don't usually allow. He came to see me on the 4th day, dressed impeccably, offering condolences with a face arranged into perfect sorrow, and somewhere in the middle of his sympathy he mentioned, almost casually, that the paperwork for the share transfer was ready whenever I felt strong enough to sign. Strong enough. As if grief were the only obstacle standing between me and his signature. I told him I needed a week. He said, of course, take all the time you need, Mara, we're family. Family. The word sat wrong in my mouth the way spoiled milk sits wrong on the tongue. That night I called my father's old private investigator, a woman named Renate Ibarra who had helped him vet Voss Textiles' original supply contracts 15 years earlier, and I asked her to find out everything she could about the car in the crash, the road conditions, and where exactly Julian Voss had been in the 6 hours before it happened. She called me back 2 days later with a voice flat and careful. Mara, she said, there's no confirmed body. Dental records are pending. And the car that burned was registered to a rental company Adrian's firm uses for corporate travel, not to Julian at all. I didn't sleep that night, or the one after. I sat at my kitchen table with Renata's report spread out under the lamp and read it until the words blurred, then read it again the way my father had taught me. The rental car had been picked up at a private airstrip 2 hours outside the city, paid for in cash by someone using a corporate account linked to Adrian's holding company, not Julian's personal accounts. Cell tower data placed a phone registered to Julian near that same airstrip at 11 p.m. the night before the crash, then nothing, silence, the phone going dark exactly 40 minutes before the accident was reported. Renata had also pulled flight manifests from 3 regional airports, and on one of them, a small charter service 2 counties over, a passenger named J. Voigt had boarded a flight to Panama City at 12:30 a.m. J. Voigt. Julian's mother's maiden name was Voigt. I remembered him joking about it once, early in our relationship, saying if he ever needed to disappear he'd use his mother's name because nobody in his family ever bothered to check records that far back. He'd said it laughing, lightly, the way people say dark things when they think the darkness will never actually arrive. I sat with that laugh in my memory for a long time, turning it over, feeling it change shape from something charming into something that had always, quietly, been a plan. I thought about the wedding date. Julian had insisted on moving it up by 3 months, citing tax reasons connected to the merger between our family's companies, a merger that would only finalize once we were legally married and our shares were combined under a single joint account, an account Adrian would have signing authority over as best man and family attorney of record. If we'd married as scheduled, my 40% would have become part of a joint marital asset, dissolvable, transferable, and if I died or disappeared or simply signed the wrong document in my grief, it would have slid quietly into Adrian's control without a single objection from anyone, because who questions a grieving widow doing what her dead fiancé asked? I understood then, sitting at that table at 4 in the morning, that I had not lost a fiancé in a car accident. I had been marked, months in advance, as an asset to be liquidated. I called Renata again before sunrise and told her I needed everything on Adrian's finances, every account, every shell company, every wire transfer for the past 18 months, and I told her not to stop even if it took every dollar I had left in savings. She asked me what I planned to do with it. I told her the truth. I plan to bury him the way he tried to bury me, except I intend to still be standing when it's done. 2 weeks passed in which I played the role they expected of me, red-eyed, soft-spoken, agreeable in small ways that cost me nothing. I let Adrian believe I was close to signing. I told his lawyer I needed grief counseling before I could face the paperwork, and he offered, generously, to have his own therapist recommend someone, a woman it turned out was on retainer with his firm, paid to write reports about my mental state that could later be used to argue I wasn't competent to manage my own shares. I went to 2 sessions and said almost nothing true in either of them, and afterward I drove straight to Renata's office and read the growing file she'd built, page by page, watching a picture assemble itself the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, faint at first, then suddenly, undeniably clear. Adrian had been draining Voss Textiles for over a year, routing supplier payments through inflated invoices to a company he owned under his wife's maiden name. The same trick, apparently, ran in the family. Julian had discovered it 6 months before our wedding, according to an email Renata recovered from a deleted server backup, and instead of exposing his own brother, he had cut a deal. His silence and eventual disappearance in exchange for a percentage of what Adrian planned to extract once the company was fully under family control, once my shares were folded in and I was safely out of the picture, whether through a signed document or simply through the fog of a widow too devastated to look closely at anything placed in front of her. My hands shook reading it, not from grief anymore but from something colder and more useful. I called attorney Denise Okafor the next morning, the same woman who had handled my father's estate and who had once told me over dinner that she never lost a case built on paper because paper, unlike people, does not know how to lie convincingly for long. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she said one sentence that steadied me more than anything else had in 3 weeks. Mara, we're not going to stop them from thinking you're broken. We're going to let them keep thinking it, right up until the moment it matters. Denise moved fast once she understood the shape of it, filing emergency petitions to freeze any transfer of Voss Textiles shares pending a fraud investigation, quietly enough that Adrian wouldn't hear about it from the courthouse grapevine for at least a week, And in that week we built the case the way you build a wall, one brick set carefully atop the last. Renata traced 11 shell accounts back to Adrian's wife's maiden name, matched invoice numbers to phantom suppliers that didn't exist, cross-referenced flight records showing Adrian had visited Panama City twice in the past 4 months under the guise of sourcing new fabric mills. I kept playing my part at home, tearful at the right moments, evasive about the paperwork in ways that read as grief rather than delay, and every night after Adrian's calls ended I sat with Denise's team going over financial statements until my eyes burned. On the 10th day, Peter Cho, the assistant who delivered Julian's letter, came to see me alone, without telling Adrian first, his hands trembling around a coffee cup he never drank from. He said he'd helped Julian book the charter flight because Julian told him it was for a business trip, a real one, and it wasn't until after the funeral, after seeing how calm Adrian was, how prepared, that Peter started to feel sick about what he might have been part of. He gave me a printed copy of a text thread between Julian and Adrian from 2 nights before the crash, forwarded to his own phone by accident when Julian meant to send it elsewhere. Julian, she still doesn't suspect anything. Adrian, good. Once she signs post-funeral, we liquidate through the offshore account, split it, you disappear properly this time, permanently, no more Panama postcards. Julian, and Mara? Adrian, widows don't fight for shares, they fight for closure. Give her a nice memorial and she'll sign anything you ask. I read it twice, then a 3rd time, the way my father taught me, and something inside me that had still, foolishly, been grieving a man finally understood there was no man left to grieve, only a plan wearing his face. I asked Peter if he'd testify. He said yes, quietly, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. Denise scheduled the memorial service for the following week, the one Adrian had been pushing for since the accident, insisting it would give me closure and, not so quietly, give him the emotional cover he needed to finalize the paperwork afterward, when I would be, in his words, more receptive. I agreed to hold it at the Voss Textiles headquarters atrium, the same room where my father used to hold shareholder meetings, the same room where Julian and Adrian's father had once announced the company's first international contract with my father standing proudly beside him. It felt right to end things there. The morning of the memorial I wore black, no makeup, my eyes genuinely swollen because grief, even grief for a lie, still costs something real. Adrian met me at the door looking appropriately solemn, murmuring about strength and family and how proud Julian would be, and I let him walk me to the front row without flinching, though every word out of his mouth now sounded to me like a man reading lines he'd rehearsed in a mirror. The room filled with employees, board members, distant relatives, reporters from 2 business journals covering the tragic loss of a rising textile heir. Adrian gave the eulogy himself, voice cracking at all the practiced places, and when he finished he turned to me and asked, in front of everyone, gently, publicly, whether I had any words I wanted to share for Julian, a question designed to look like kindness and function like a trap, because a grieving widow crying through a few soft sentences was exactly the image he needed on record before he pushed the transfer papers across my desk that afternoon. I stood. I walked to the podium the way I'd watched my father walk to it 100 times, unhurried, sure of my footing. I looked at Julian's portrait, the one Adrian had chosen, flattering, confident, nothing like the man who'd written me an envelope full of instructions on how to hand his birthright away. I said, my husband left me a letter telling me to sell my father's shares to protect me from debt, and for 3 weeks I believed that letter came from love. Then I found out it came from a plan. The room went still in that particular way rooms go still right before they understand they're about to watch something break open. I nodded to Denise, seated in the 3rd row with her laptop already open, and the screen behind me came alive. First, the flight manifest, J. Voight, boarding a charter to Panama City 40 minutes after Julian's phone went dark, the same night the rental car, paid for by Adrian's holding company, burned on the coastal highway with a body that dental records, released that very morning under court order, confirmed did not belong to Julian Voss at all, but to an unidentified man whose remains investigators were now treating as a homicide, a fact the room had not yet been told, and that landed like a physical blow. Someone in the back row gasped audibly. A board member half rose from his seat. Adrian's face, for the first time since I'd known him, lost its careful arrangement entirely. Zoe, he started, wrong name, my name, catching himself, Mara, this isn't the place. I kept going. I put up the text thread Peter Cho had handed me, Julian's own words glowing on the screen above his own memorial portrait. Widows don't fight for shares, they fight for closure. Someone near the front stood and walked out, phone already pressed to her ear, and I understood she was calling either the press or her lawyer, possibly both. I put up the shell company records, 11 accounts under Adrian's wife's maiden name, invoices for fabric mills that satellite imagery, pulled by Renata 2 days earlier, showed had been empty lots for 6 years. I put up the wire transfers, the pattern of it laid bare in red and black, money bleeding out of Voss Textiles for 18 months while my father's old company, the company I still held 40% of, was quietly hollowed out from the inside by the very family that had smiled at every holiday dinner and called me their own. Adrian lunged for the podium, or tried to, and 2 security officers Denise had arranged to have stationed discreetly near the exits stepped in before he reached me, their presence calm and immovable, the way things become inevitable once the paperwork behind them is finally airtight. Peter Cho stood up from his seat in the second row, visibly shaking, and told the room, in a voice that cracked halfway through, that he had booked the charter flight himself under Adrian's direction, believing it was a business trip, only understanding afterward what it had actually been. The board chair, an old colleague of my father's who had never fully trusted Adrian's rapid rise through the company, called for an emergency vote right there in the atrium, suspending Adrian's authority over all Voss Textiles accounts pending a full criminal and financial investigation. It passed unanimously within 4 minutes. I did not smile. I did not cry either. I simply stood at the podium my father used to stand at and watched a family that had tried to write my life's ending for me instead write its own. Julian was found 11 days later in a small coastal town outside Panama City, living under his mother's maiden name exactly as he'd once joked about, and extradition proceedings began within the month once the second body from the burned rental car was formally identified as a homeless man named Curtis Vane who had, according to phone records, been paid by Adrian's account to deliver a package to that exact rental lot the night of the crash, a payment that became the single piece of evidence. That turned the case from corporate fraud into something far heavier, something neither brother would talk their way out of no matter how many lawyers their family's dwindling money could still afford. Denise finalized the freeze on all shared assets within the week, and my father's 40%, protected the entire time by paperwork I had signed carefully, twice read, exactly the way he'd taught me, remained mine, untouched, unbroken. I sold my apartment 6 months later, the one where I'd once hung a wedding dress on a closet door and waited for a man who was never coming back in any form worth waiting for, and I moved into a smaller place near the water, quiet, mine, with no portraits on the walls and no envelopes waiting on the nightstand. Voss Textiles was restructured under new independent leadership within the year, my father's name restored to the boardroom plaque where Adrian had quietly removed it 18 months earlier. I visit that boardroom sometimes, on ordinary Tuesdays, just to sit at the long table and remember what my father told me the last week of his life, sitting in his hospital bed, holding my hand with more strength than I thought he had left. Mara, he said, people will try to convince you that grief makes you weak. Let them believe that as long as you need them to. Just make sure that when the moment comes, you're the one holding the pen.